Well, this week has seen associates of President Trump mired in blockbuster legal developments. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team refusing to rule out new charges against Paul Manafort. This after he allegedly broke his plea deal with Mueller. And President Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty Thursday to lying to Congress and falsely downplaying Trump's effort to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Joining me now is Anna Schecter, reporter for NBC News, Seth Hatena, author of Trump Russia, A Definitive History, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney, professor at University of Alabama School of Law, and an NBC News contributor. Anna, you just had a conversation. You just sat down, and we're going to get to the pieces of news I just brought up, but you have some news yourself because you just met with the lawyer of Donald Trump Jr., and that's important because of the developments of what happened with Michael Cohen on Thursday. I'm going to get to that, but I want to start with what did you learn from your discussion after sitting down with his lawyer, Donald Trump Jr.'s?
It was really surprising to hear how confident he sounds. He's been very open from day one with Mueller's team. So many months ago, they sent thousands of pages of communications and texts and emails. He feels like they have a good working relationship. So it remains to be seen if there will be an indictment. I mean, he seems confident that there won't be. But what we've seen Mueller do is look at communications, even allow witnesses to amend their testimony, like we saw with Jerome Corsi, and then still come after them and charge them with lying to investigators after an amended testimony has been given. So we'll see. We really don't know.
Yeah, and the issue here, Joyce Vance, is because of what happened let's go to that now, on Thursday with Michael Cohen and this issue of lying, and then thereon we are seeing many representatives from Congress saying, hey, if you lied to us, we're going to get you. And so therefore, where were the conflicts? Now is Donald Trump Jr. in the crosshairs, people are asking.
So certainly there will be scrutiny of his testimony. It's not enough to say that there were lies or omissions. They have to be material to the subject of the investigation. So once that transcript in its entirety is available for Mueller's review, a determination will be made. But it's not just his testimony in front of up on Capitol Hill that would cause Trump Jr. to have exposure. There's the possibility now, as we move on to scrutiny of the Trump-Moscow deal, that there may be improprieties there, possibly violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or other sorts of issues that might come to light. So I think it's premature to say that he's not in the crosshairs, particularly because it doesn't appear that Mueller has had him in front of the grand jury. And usually it's the targets of investigations who don't go in front of grand juries or come up for questioning.
Questioning Seth Hatena and then the answers. And what are those answers? And the answers so far, it seems to be, at least from the developments in the last week and the other previous 560-odd days, that there is this background, which you've written about, is the Trump-Russia relationship. And the president said publicly sometimes that he has nothing to do with Russia, never has, never will. And in other cases, he has said that he, or indicated, I should say, intimated that there has been some discussions.
Right. Well, let me make 2 points. First, it seems to me everybody connected with Trump-Russia is lying. Paul Manafort is lying. You know, Michael Cohen is lying. George Papadopoulos is lying. Michael Flynn is lying. Everybody is lying. They're lying to protect the president. And he's maybe the biggest liar of them all. And you know, second of all, and this is what this story I've been trying to tell, you know, what the Cohen plea shows to me, this is about money. You know, it's simple as that. Donald Trump has been chasing a project in Russia for decades.
What kind of money?
Well, we're talking, you know, real estate development money. We're talking, you know, and his businesses have been set up to facilitate money laundering from Russian criminals for years. This goes back to the 1980s through the 90s. I mean, this is, you know, this is an old story. And the Trump Tower Moscow was the shiny toy that Russia was dangling in front of him, and he would do anything for that.
I would just jump in to talk about the Trump Tower Moscow deal that Michael Cohen was pursuing. Now, he might have been freelancing to please his boss. He knew that Donald Trump, he wants to do deals in Russia. He wants to make money. But he was really the one initiating it. And his business partner was Felix Sater, a convicted felon, as you said. But there were two deals. So Michael Cohen was pushing this deal, which went on 2015 and into 2016, well into 2016. Don Jr. testified really about both deals, about that deal that he was only peripherally aware of, according to the testimony, and also another deal with the Agalarov, two of the richest men in Russia, Aras the father and Emin the pop star the son. And that was the deal that Don Jr. was more involved in. So when I went through carefully looking at the transcript, I actually didn't see too much exposure there because he was forthright about these two deals and about those dates. He did insinuate that the deal that Michael Cohen was pushing did go on into 2015 and possibly, well, he said not 2016, but it, his awareness of it ended around January 2016.
Joyce Vance?
So it'll depend, at least for his liability for those statements, whether they prove to be material. And for that, we would have to know a lot of facts that we just don't know at this point in time. If, in fact, there's nothing illegal about the deal and his lack of awareness or peripheral awareness isn't important, then he's probably in the clear. But if it turns out that the fact of his knowledge about this second effort to build a Trump Tower in Moscow is somehow material to, let's say, collusion, maybe if the financial dealings are related to Moscow's preferred help for the campaign, then he could be in trouble. As with all things legal, it's a little bit tantalizing, and it's also really easy to get over your skis. We have to know all of the facts before we have real answers here.
Anna Schecter, Joyce Vance, Seth Aten, I owe you one.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.